So coming off of the previous chapter, we saw Okkotsu getting himself into like this three-way fight with Takako and Ryu, two of, I guess, the strongest sorcerers in this Sendai colony. He fought Takako more so in the beginning of that chapter, but at the end we saw him like successfully evading Ryu's like initial cursed energy blast, which come from his hair, which I guess is like his curse technique. And he was able to close the distance by sneaking up behind him to get more into like a close quarters physical fight. And that brings us to the beginning of the chapter here, where Ryu is like, you want to get in close? And this is like the beginning of his like food analogies that he uses in this chapter. This like reminds me of Sukuna, especially like the way that he was talking in the Shibuya arc. And I don't necessarily know if Ryu is from Sukuna's time, because as I've been saying, he's like a rockabilly. So unless he decided to adopt that hairstyle like 1,000 years ago, meaning that he was like incredibly ahead of his time, it's possible that, I don't know, maybe he comes from like the 40s or the 50s or something. We don't really know the timeline of things with all of these people that Kenjaku has made deals with. The people that have been implied to be turned into like cursed objects and then eaten so that they can later be revived into this culling game. But speaking of that, he's giving us some more insight into his former life, where he says, I was a moderate eater. I fought worthy opponents and met a good woman, so I don't particularly have any regret. But I can't stand this vague thirst, Okkotsu, and no one understands why I can't get no satisfaction. My life never had dessert. So I guess this just ultimately boils down to him needing like a worthy opponent. And this might mean that he didn't come from 1,000 years ago, because that was said to be like the golden age of Jujutsu, where there was like nothing but ultra powerhouses all around and whatnot. And when he was saying this, I was thinking like, okay, so I guess you never fought like a Sukuna type person. Clearly, because he would have lost to him if he did. I guess that's a large component of why he decided to join the culling game. Like I said, many of the other sorcerers here, especially from the past, kind of hunger for these fights. They're like Saiyans in a way. But then they have like this brief hand-to-hand exchange. Okkotsu saying like his output is high. He releases cursed energy with near instantaneous explosiveness. And I guess this goes back to the exposition that we got from him initially, where it said he has the highest cursed energy output of all of the players. And they go into like this traditional martial arts like shoulder clash thing, and this is pretty incredible. I'm not even sure if we've really seen this before, or at least I can't remember off the top of my head. Two extremely powerful sorcerers like this colliding and then having like electricity come off of them. This is like a Conqueror hockey clash for One Piece or something. And I guess stuff like this is going to be more prevalent as we go deeper into this arc, since this is like a funneling of all of the strongest characters in the series essentially. So we're going to see some crazy stuff on the power scale that we necessarily haven't seen before. But surprisingly, Okkotsu is the one that is getting like knocked away by this, and Ryu saying like, I'm unsatisfied because I ain't full, meaning like I guess he hasn't had like a truly worthy opponent yet, or somebody that has pushed him far enough to his liking. Then Ryu tries to capitalize on Okkotsu and like fires a granite blast at him, and Okkotsu like blocks it barehanded and then counters with like his own strike, sending Ryu like into the ground. And of course this gets the attention of Ryu, saying like, are you my dessert, Okkotsu? Meaning like, are you my worthy challenge that I'm finally going to get? And it seems like Okkotsu didn't necessarily beast through that blast as much as we probably initially thought, because we see in this panel here where Takako is coming up behind him, his hand was like nuked by that, like he's missing fingers and stuff. So I guess this was more so Okkotsu taking one to give one, because he knows that he can just use reverse curse technique to heal himself, so he can afford to have reckless defense like this. But as Takako's coming up behind him, she's giving us, I guess, the best explanation of her curse technique that we're gonna get maybe. She says, I don't hit the person, I hit the surface of the sky, and I break that surface like thin ice, and my opponent with it. So I guess this is the secret of how she was able to make impacts in the previous chapter. Because if we go back to the previous chapter, we actually see her doing this, but we weren't really aware of it because we didn't have too much information on it yet. But in that chapter, when she does her follow-up attack on Okkotsu, we see her breaking the surface, and that like sends Okkotsu back. And that's where he realizes that his arm was back to normal after being warped, but he was still pushed back by her breaking the surface, despite her not actually hitting him directly, which goes into his dialogue right after that sequence, where he said her curse technique probably controls space, but maybe it can't actually crush her opponent. Because if she could then she would just, I guess, be the strongest character in the series, right? She could just warp you and then break you into a million pieces, and then that's it. She sends Okkotsu into like a rooftop after that, and this angers Ryu because, you know, that was his dessert that he's going after, and they exchange some nice little insults, and Ryu fires a granite blast at her, but she uses her ability to warp the space around her and like twist the beam up and diverts it right back at him. And we read this in the spoilers, and I was really curious to see how he's going to be able to take this, and it appears that, yeah, he did take it on the chin. He can dish it out and take it as well. I guess not so surprisingly, he says, "I've never been hit by my own technique before," which I guess goes back to how he's never had his dessert, which further goes into him never being tested enough or pushed far enough, which means it's very likely he never had a caliber of an opponent who would be able to redirect his attack back at him. Then Okkotsu gets back up, and they both kind of acknowledge that, hey, you know, he's pretty tough, as we kind of assumed he was. And Ryu gives us some more insight into reverse curse technique and the toll that it takes, because he says his reverse curse technique is a problem, which I talked about how he can just brute force block something like the granite blast, willingly damaging his limbs because he could just regenerate them. But it consumes a lot of cursed energy. He used it every time Kurorushi, Uro, and I used big moves, which is true because we saw Kurorushi really did a lot of damage to him in their brief fight. So before even coming into this triple threat match, he had already used reverse curse technique on like his torso and shoulder. Then going further, Ryu says, "And I think you're finally bottoming out, Okkotsu." Bottoming out being used here is pretty interesting because Okkotsu's cursed energy was referred to as being bottomless. And I think this might give us more insight into what's going to happen at the end here. Then Ryu's like, "I guess you ain't it," meaning like, I guess you're not the one who's going to push me to where I want to be pushed. Then we get an inner monologue from Okkotsu basically saying that like Ryu doesn't target normal people, but he won't be mad if one of them die from like collateral damage, meaning that he's not like the two other sorcerers that Okkotsu had to deal with. He's not going to go out of his way to like take out civilians and whatnot, but he won't hesitate like fighting around them, and if one of his blasts or whatever like kills them in the process, like it's whatever to him. And then he says, "I wanted to put more distance between us and the people in the stadium, but that isn't going to happen." Again, these people that he was protecting in the stadium initially from Druve, and then after he took him out, then he had to defend them against Kurorushi's cockroach swarm. And that's also the reason why Rika wasn't involved in this fight in the first place, because she was protecting the people in the stadium in case they were to become collateral damage. Then Okkotsu just gets to the point of where it's like, well, I guess it can't be helped. And he holds up his hand showing like the Rika ring, and he says, "Come Rika, give me everything." And that's where the chapter ends. And this goes back to what I was talking about, him bottoming out, but also him having alleged bottomless cursed energy. Whatever kind of relationship he has with this new Rika, I think has to do with his cursed energy in general. It's possible that the ring maybe has some kind of binding vow to it or something, and Rika is like a composite of most of his cursed energy or something, and that's how he's able to contain it. Like he has this initial reserve in him as a whole that just makes him Okkotsu the powerhouse, but the rest of his cursed energy is just maybe too much for him to handle, so it's been converted into Rika, but also it's a part of the ring. Maybe the ring is working as a conduit or a vessel the way that Gojo wanted him to use the sword initially in Volume 0. Again, I'm just taking some guesses here. We don't really know too much about what's going on with him and the new Rika yet. Hopefully we'll get more insight into that into the next chapter, but I know you guys already know everything that's going on, so let me know in the comments. And if you like the video, please give it a like, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great day. I'll see you in the next one.